the wider body of stakeholders. So that is why now there is a clear realization on behalf of all responsible and mature companies that the operations of a company must be conducted responsively and responsibly. I hope you understand the critical distinction. Responsibly is in terms of engaging in a very mature way, and responsibly is to try and appreciate that the company has a role and has a responsibility towards the community and others. Just to widen that further, in the course of the supply chain network, you understand, for example, there is this logistics, supply, transportation, and the like, where, either the inputs, raw materials, intermediates of a company come in, and the finished products get sent out through the supply chain network. The way it is done will also have a bearing. So all the stakeholders involved in the supply chain network, for example, if it's an export-oriented operation, it could be starting from the transporter, the port involved, the various functionaries who assist in the discharge of the cargo in the port, the loading of that onto merchant ships, and finally at the end destination, it will be the consumers. All of them are stakeholders in the process. So if we have understood this distinction, let's then move on to some of the other critical elements of the paradigm of corporate governance. I hope you understand again the differentiation between public sector and private sector companies. Now, public sector companies are those which are owned substantively or partially by the government. It could be the central government, it could be the jurisdictional state government, it could be the government of the union territory, depending upon the location. Now, equity stakes of these government companies may well be 51% and above, where majority stakes are held by the government or the public exchequer, as we understand. So these are all companies which belong to the government, at least a clear majority and above. Today, largely, most public sector undertakings, there are roughly about 170 under the central government, which have equity stakes of 51% or more, but perhaps not more than 75% ordinarily. One of the classic and the most talked about contemporaneous example of a public sector undertaking which has got privatized wholly is Air India. It was as of just the 1st of February that Air India management, on the 27th of January, I beg your pardon, that the management and complete control of Air India as an erstwhile public sector undertaking has been handed over entirely to the Tata Group of companies. That is the most successful recent instance of privatization or divestment or disinvestment as we understand. So these are part of corporate governance processes. As against this, companies which are completely owned by the private sector or wholly or substantially owned by the private sector of 51% equity stakes or more are known as private companies. Now, again, in these two subsets, you can have further subsets under them, such as listed companies, unlisted companies, public companies, private companies, for example. Listed companies are those, as you must have read, perhaps have understood, are companies or corporate bodies whose shares are listed in exchanges or bourses, as we know. For example, you have the National Stock Exchange, the Bombay Stock Exchange, the two primary indices where the shares of a given company get listed and, more importantly, get transacted or traded over a period of time. They're either bought or sold or retained through this medium or funnel or conduit called as a trading exchange. So you have the BSE or the NSE, and there's this commodity exchange for commodity shares, dealing shares, etc. So those are companies which are listed. The reason why I want to sort of emphasize on the word listed is that there is a greater sense of responsibility, a larger onus which is cast by the Companies Act, which I will come to in some time, 2013, on how the business of a listed company should get conducted. In contrast, you have unlisted companies whose shares are not traded or transacted or listed in any exchange. That's an entirely discretionary matter. That's a decision of the management of the company, whether it wants to list or not list. The rationale for listing and unlisting is simply because listing enables a company to mobilize funds or resources from the capital markets. I hope you understand what capital market is. There is a primary market, there is a secondary market. Primary market, in as much as where a company floats an IPO, an initial public offer of its shares or scrips, and raises a certain amount of money when it is subscribed by individual investors, high net investors, or institutional investors, or even foreign institutional investors. So that is known as an IPO. That's where a company goes into the primary market with the intention of mobilizing funds. And the reason could be that it needs the capital so raised for purposes of investment in plant and machinery for the first time, or for expansion of its operations, or simply to retain as reserves, as the case may be. Along with the IPO, there is an allied concept called as FPO, follow-on public offer, which is a subsequent tranche or a set of scrips or stocks which are released by the company through the trading mechanism of the stock exchange, again to raise resources. And this gets conducted from time to time. So the purpose of listing is only to mobilize resources on a public platform, which is why it goes public. Alternately, you could have a private company which does not wish to list itself, because listing brings a whole set of different ball game. There are regulations which are very stringent, because when you come to the capital markets, you are bound by the rules of the game. Many companies find it very difficult to comply with those regulatory subsets, which is why they don't prefer to go to the stock markets and hence stay away from listing of their shares. However, that does not prevent them from raising monies through private sources. It could be the promoter's capital. It could be through any other private equity source that it may choose to do so. Now, the final distinction here I would like to bring in is the concept of a public company and a private company. A public company is where the shares are held outside a closed door network. It is not, it is the shares or the scripts or the equity is held on a more open and transparent platform, not necessarily through a listing thing, but where it is offered for a larger body of public participants. In contrast, a private company is one where it does not wish to go the public way. It is held by a very close knit of individuals or a group of individuals who wish to remain private. So as a result, for all of these companies, whether it's a public sector company, it's a private sector company, it's be it a listed or an unlisted or a public company or a private company, the rules of operation are somewhat different, are modified, are tweaked in terms of the listing and disclosure obligations of the Securities Exchange Board of India, which is the SEBI, and listing and disclosure regulations are known as LODR. They are known as the SEBI LODR. Now, these are for purposes of compliance, and I'll introduce here what essentially we mean by compliance. Compliance means subscribing or following the given set of rules and regulations which are mandated by a statute or legislation or a parliament enacted law. For instance, you've heard of the Companies Act 2013. Prior to that, the earlier avatar of the Companies Act went back to the year 1956. So over a period of time, the Companies Act is essentially a framework or a template of rules and regulations on how a company can be constituted, how it gets incorporated, how its capital is subscribed, how it is run, how does it discharge its obligations, how does it wish to dissolve itself eventually, what are its liabilities, and how does it deal with its assets, etc. So the entire paradigm of governance of a company is enshrined by the substance of the Companies Act, which is a legal framework. The Companies Act was enacted by the Parliament. The first avatar was in the year 1956. That remained on the statute books until 2013. Over a period of time, it was felt that this framework needed a much needed revision. So there were amendments to the 1956 framework over a period of time, as and when occasion. However, towards the period from around 2000, early 2000, 2005 more specifically, there was a growing sense that the Companies Act 1956 had become almost obsolete, given the fact that much water had flowed down. There was liberalization which had happened, privatization and globalization which had happened in the Indian economy from 1991. So there was a greater sense of flexibility that needed to be given to corporate governance over a period of time. And there were various global developments which were impacting the way a company operation could get conducted. So hence, there was a clear realization and a belief that the company's law framework had to be rewritten. That's why this mandate or task was given to several committees which went in. For example, some of the few famous committees which were headed, I'll give you a few names. There was this N.R. Narayan Murthy committee. There was this Uday Kotak committee. And there were a few others as well. So over a period of time, somewhere around 2011, there was this clear realization on the part of the government that the erstwhile 1956 law had to be repealed or revoked, and simultaneously a new legal framework had to be put in place. And that saw the advent of the new Companies Act in the year 2013. That is the legal framework which prevails as of today. It's about 9 years old. It has served the interests of the corporate sector reasonably well. There have been a few tweakings and amendments even amidst that, because please remember that any corporate governance framework is not cast in stone, which means that nothing remains static. Whatever is brought about as a body or a set of regulations has to be necessarily dynamic. It has to be open to sort of adaptation and adoption to the trends and developments which keep happening and influence and impact the way the companies work. And these trends and developments could be within the country or it could be globally. How does, for example, an external or an international element impact, you may ask, a company in India? You must have heard of FIIs, foreign institutional investors, or the other concept of foreign direct investment, FDI. Now, when you have foreign players, they could be individuals, large, people with significant deep pockets, as we call them, individuals who could be in a position to invest in a company in India, or they could be institutions, either private equity players, PE firms, venture capitalists, which is VC firms, or angel investors, as we call them, who promote startups, etc. So all of these, when they see that there is a growth story, now India is clearly an emerging economy. For the past 10 years, it has been demonstrated. In the last 2 years, even in the midst of pandemic, it is now a well-known fact, and these are borne out by statistics of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other multilateral financial institutions, that the pace of growth in the GDP, the gross domestic product of India, is already emerging as the fastest across the world, whether it is amongst mature developed economies or even developing, let alone the least developing countries, the LDCs. It is estimated that the World Bank estimates just released very recently indicate that the Indian economy is likely to grow at an average of around 9%. I mean, this is forgetting the base effect, but other than that, which is by far way ahead of even China, which is around 6.5 to 7%. So the point is, when this perception goes around in the globe that India is an investment destination worth putting their money in, they will come in, whether they want to, be equity partners through foreign direct investment, where they want to put in monies and, control the operations of the company, or they just want to participate either through the primary market or the secondary capital market. Secondary capital market, in contrast to an IPO and an FPO, is where they pick up shares over a period of time. So when the growth story or the narrative starts impressing the foreigners, they want to come in either through the FII or the FDI route. This is how monies are raised. Now, so any trend, whether it is internal or external, will have an influence, either positive or negative, on the way a company is run. Which is why, to come back to the point that I was laboring earlier, is that the Companies Act is not something which is static, which is cast in stone, which is to say that if it was enacted by Parliament in 2013, that it would remain the way it is. It has to be a very vibrant or dynamic instrument of state policy, where it must recognize that if there are deficiencies in the provisions of the Companies Act, there must be amendments to that, or rules and regulations, subsidiary legislation must come in to promote the spirit, the letter and spirit of implementation of the Companies Act. Now, Companies Act is the primary piece of legislation or enactment or law. Other than that, the regulatory framework also consists, for example, of the capital market regulator. You are aware of the Security Exchange Board of India, the SEBI, which is the body which regulates the way the security market or the capital markets is operated. So SEBI has an act going back to the year 1992, although the SEBI came into being in 1993 post that. SEBI also has its own set of regulations to govern the corporates. I mentioned to you earlier, if you recall, the LODR, the listing obligations and disclosure regulations. Please mark the words listing obligations and disclosures. Now, these are two different connotations. Listing, as I've explained to you, is where the scrips or the equity or the shares of a company get listed in an exchange and then are traded or transacted, either bought or sold by whoever wishes to transact over different points in time. The obligations are that when you list, the company is obliged to follow the mandate. And you may ask why. That is to essentially protect the interests of the shareholders. It cannot be that a company can list itself and do whatever it wishes to do in a reckless manner. It is bound by those obligations to conduct its business, its affairs very responsibly and responsibly. That is why those obligations are cast on every single company which wants to list. Then you may want to know what exactly is the word disclosure. This is now a concept which is coming into play increasingly. When you say disclosure, it is so critical because the way a company is run its operations are conducted or carried out, there must be transparency in terms of revealing as to what the company does. For example, the financial results of a company on a quarter-on-quarter basis or an annualized basis through the company annual report. They need to be brought out into the public domain where the shareholders and also, for example, the stakeholders at large, they should be made aware of how a company is run. That is why there is a disclosure requirement. Disclosure means you cannot hold information or data pertaining to the way the operations of the companies are done to within the space of the board of directors or within the internal senior management or the key management personnel. It is imperative or absolutely necessary by law to put it out in the public domain for the wider consumption of all interested parties such as shareholders as well as stakeholders. That is why there is a disclosure mandate. It becomes compulsory to reveal to the public as to what a company is doing or is not doing, conversely. So that if there is a guidance required from the shareholders or the stakeholders, that is available to them. So, sorry, I think there was a temporary. So if you understood the broader mandate of the law, so let's understand, before I go on to the actual mechanics and dynamics of how a corporate governance operates, let me just give you why the proposition or concept of corporate governance has now come into the fore, into public attention, so to speak. Let me give you 2-3 examples of what went seriously wrong overseas in the international arena. And I will also give you 2-3 illustrations to just give you a flavor or a sample of why it is necessary to uphold principles of corporate governance in a company. What it means, not just for the company, the shareholder, the stakeholders, but also for the community and the economy as a whole and the nation in the wider context. I don't know. I mean, this is clearly, I think some of you perhaps may have been just born or may not even have been born. I'll give you 3 classic examples which are widely known overseas. In the year 2000 or towards the end of the 1990s, there was a very storied marquee company known as Enron. I don't know how many of you recall, if some of you have studied economic history of India. In early 1990s, Enron, which is one of the largest multinational companies in the world, it was one of the Fortune 500 companies. It was perhaps within the top 500 companies across the world. It was headquartered in the US, United States of America. They decided to set up a plant in Dabhol in Maharashtra, for purposes of, electricity manufacture, generation. So that is where the Indian Connect came. However, by the end of the 1990s, Enron collapsed as a company. The reason why you may ask, this is a classic case of gross mismanagement by the top management of the company, where they completely lost sight, they deliberately sort of chose to ignore basic corporate governance standards. They didn't think it necessary to look at the wider interests of the shareholders, much less of the stakeholders. They decided that the senior management will make all the money by illegal means. So what they did is, over a period of time, there was this classic example of asset stripping, where there will be siphoning of funds from a company, either, intercompany, that is between 2 set of companies, or intra-group companies, where funds would be diverted from one company to another, essentially to try and launder money for the benefit of the senior management, which is what happened with Enron. Enron collapsed because the senior management, the chairman, Kenneth Lay, and the CEO, and etc., they all decided to line their pockets. They made millions of dollars at personal expense and forgot that they owed a responsibility towards the shareholders. And I mean, there was not even a concept of a stakeholder back then. So Enron was a scandal which led to huge shockwaves in the United States of America. And that triggered, if I don't know how many of you may be aware, that triggered the introduction of what is known as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act or the SOX Act, SOX, in the United States, where there was, virtually there was a 360-degree turn in the way the corporate governance framework in the United States was framed. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, this is named after two congressmen who introduced this bill in the United States Congress. They said that there has to be stringency in the way corporate governance will get conducted, the way the listings will hold. It became extremely tight and stringent. So this SOX Act was a reaction to the Enron scandal. So Enron scandal was representing one set of the corporate America, where there was reckless disregard for the way the affairs of a company could be run. It was primarily meant to promote the interests of the senior management and completely ignoring the interests of the shareholders. So then the SOX Act, which came in, made it so stringent that it became extremely difficult for companies to do business in the US. Then you must have heard of the year 2008, where there was a financial sector meltdown in the Wall Street in the United States of America, which is the financial capital of the world. You may have perhaps heard a famous company back then, which completely collapsed and shut down, called as Lehman Brothers, Lehman Brothers. That was a financial institution, one of the largest across the globe. It was storied, it was renowned. But again, though it is a financial institution, the way it was run, it was only as if the senior management interest sort of was to be promoted. Then there were other companies which just completely broke down and disappeared. There was two other institutions, I don't know how many of you may be aware, called as Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. These are representations of the vulgarity of the corporate governance framework in the United States, the obscenity, as it were, where capitalism at its worst, if you could see, that was represented by the way these companies were run. And if you've read of the impact of the financial sector meltdown in 2008 and early 2009, it set off shockwaves, literally a volcanic earthquake, a tsunami of effect across financial institutions. Several other companies collapsed. Literally lakhs of jobs. People got jobless. Houses which were mortgaged, there were foreclosures in the US. A lot of people lost their homes. Economies, the GDP came tumbling down. So all this is an impact, a direct consequence of the way corporate governance standards failed, and the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission of the United States of America, which is the equivalent of SEBI in India, Securities Exchange Board of India, it simply did not hold companies to account. It spoke so poorly of the way SEC ran its affairs. So that is the extreme. Very recently, I mean, this is not to be misogynistic. You must have heard of a very young lady in the US who's been charged and indicted from 2018 onwards. I don't know how many of you have heard of a company called Theranos, the Theranos Group. This was in near San Francisco in California in the US. So this was to do with the way, the blood testings, samples were collected and blood testing was done. This lady, she's an American lady. She was just barely in her early 20s. She sort of decided to come about with IPOs. She raised billions of dollars of capital. Eventually, none of this technology was proven, and the company simply collapsed. Today, she stands indicted. She's probably in her early 30s. She faces a jail sentence of around 20 years at least. So this is again the collapse of corporate governance in the US. I'm citing example of US because US is the most mature, developed economy in the world. All of you are aware of it. And what happens there directly impacts or sends out shockwaves across the globe. Let's look at some of the Indian, instances or examples of how there was misgovernance in terms of corporate governance in India. Again, around 2008-9, there was a very storied company in the IT sector called as Satyams. Ramalinga Raju was the then, until then, a very famous entrepreneur based out of Hyderabad who founded this company. And eventually, in the year 2008-9, again, this entire company literally went bankrupt, and it brought down so many stakeholders, again, due to gross mismanagement. What did they do in this case? Just as an illustration, this is an IT services company, pure play IT services. They were doing exceptionally well until then, but clearly a classic case of greed overcoming the larger interests. So Ramalinga Raju and some of his promoter cronies decided that, it's best to get into real estate. So they decided to acquire through funding, diverting funds of Satyam into acquisition of large tracts of land, creating land banks. They spent thousands of crores of acquiring land with no ostensible or apparent connection to the IT sector. Mind you, when you incorporate a company, you also have something called as a memorandum of association and articles of association, which map out what exactly a company will do or will not do. It sets out the tone and tenor. That is the primary requirement when you incorporate a company. So in disregard to the memorandum of association and the articles of association of Satyam, they decided to invest. And what was singularly unfortunate and tragic was there were extremely distinguished independent directors on the board of Satyam back then. And I don't want to name anyone here. It was a collective failure of leadership, not just on the part of the promoters, the founders of the company, but the entire board of directors, where they did not raise questions. They do not ask of Ramling Raju and his other cronies as to why these investments were being made when it had no ostensible or apparent connect to the fundamental fact that Satyam was an information technology company. Yet they went and invested. That eventually led to the collapse of Satyam. Of course, finally, Tech Mahindra was grown out of that. The Mahindra Group picked up, and that became part of the Mahindra Group, and it was revived. Cut to the year 2017, you must have heard, this is, I'm sure, much more well-known in the recent past, was the example, the saga of the ILFS, Infrastructure Leasing and Financial Services Company in Bombay. So ILFS was promoted by an individual. Of course, it was run as a company, but it was run at the whims and fancies of that promoter, who decided to raise capital and mobilize loans to the tune when it eventually burst as a bubble and created havoc in the financial markets again in the year 2017. Would you believe it? There was a staggering loan bouquet of around 97,000 crores. That was the liability sitting on the books of accounts of ILFS. And this is another classic example of how there was complete collapse of corporate governance. ILFS created a web of subsidiary companies. And this is where, I would like to also bring in the proposition of a holding company and subsidiary companies as part of a group of companies. Then I'll come to the ILFS. A brief digression. You've heard a company can be either an individual company by itself, or it could have subsidiary companies which are part of it for doing XYZ part of the operations. So they constitute or incorporate smaller companies which are allied to the main company. So the main company then becomes a holding company. That means it holds the overall umbrella or architecture of the company. For example, you have Tata Sons, which is a holding company in the Tata Group. And then you have almost about 100 plus Tata Group companies. Air India is one such, the recent acquisition. You have Tata Steel, Tata Chemicals, Tata Motors, etc. So they're all subsidiary companies, but they're all part of Tata Sons. And all of them together constitute what is called as a group company. So what happened is that ILFS created an unbelievable 335 subsidiary companies, which is shocking to even contemplate that a holding company could decide to have as many as 335 subsidiaries. Can you even imagine how a group of individuals representing the board of directors, say, let's say even about 12 or so, could manage 335 subsidiaries? It is well nigh impossible, but this was a reckless disregard of corporate governance. So they created this web of companies. It was so loosely structured that the holding company virtually did not have a control on how the affairs of these subsidiaries were being run. So it came to a stage where the books of accounts of these subsidiaries were not either reflected or not appropriately reflected in, you must understand that the balance sheet of the subsidiary companies get amalgamated or fused into the balance sheet of a holding company eventually. That is required under the Companies Act. So ILFS was another classic case. So the government had to step in, disband the entire management, take over, constitute a new board of directors. And now over the past 4 years, some of the lost ground has been made good. The third and the final example, which I just want to give you, is you must have heard in the pharma sector group of companies known as Fortis or Religare and Ranbaxy. There were those two Sardar brothers, Shivinder Singh and Malvinder Singh, who again mismanaged the affairs of what until then, this was until about 7-8 years ago, companies extremely well run, very successful, were able to produce results, but because of greed, and I think the singular strand why companies are either managed well or managed badly is in terms of business or professional ethics. The piece that I want to lay here is, if the management is responsible and responsive, it is because it subscribes to a philosophy of basic ethics. And in contrast, a company which disregards that, is unethical in its business or professional practices, then comes to grief, because finally, things catch up at the end of the day. People don't realize that it is only that far you can go in life, either as an individual or a company. You can indulge in fraud, you can indulge in misrepresentation, misstatement of facts, cheating, or whatever you want to do in terms of criminality. But at the end of the day, facts and law will catch up with you. And that's what happened with Fortis as well. So I just wanted to give you 2-3 classic examples of how things, initially seem to be very successful instances. But if the management is not on its guard, it doesn't take much time before the ground starts slipping in terms of corporate governance, which is why the abiding principle of corporate governance is that the management must stay the course, or in the long haul, continue to subscribe to basic ethics, business ethics, as well as professional ethics. If companies tend to lose sight of that, then I think it spells unmitigated disaster for the company in the overall. Now, with this background, I'm aware that it is almost 10:40, and around another half an hour, I'll try and wind up, and then we could have the Q&A session. But before that, let me get into the nitty-gritties of how corporate governance gets run. I explained to you that there is a board of directors, the BOD. So usually the board of directors consists of a set of individuals. You have a chairman who could be either an executive chairman or a non-executive chairman. Then there could be a managing director or a CEO. And then there are whole-time directors or executive directors. Then a second set, there could be nominee directors. Nominee directors are those who are nominated by financial institutions who have significant stakes or equity partnership with a company. So they may want to nominate a certain senior person from their company on the board of this company where the monies have been pumped in, so as to represent and safeguard and protect the interests of such investing companies. For example, in one of the companies where I'm on the board as an independent director, the Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank of India, is a major financial stakeholder. So they have chosen to put one of their senior general managers as a nominee director to represent their interests of that 18% equity that they have in that particular company. So you have the second set known as a nominee director. And finally, you have this a new animal called as independent directors. Okay, before I come to the role and the nature of responsibilities of independent directors, you clearly understand who a chairman is, because a chairman is someone who will chair the proceedings of the board, will conduct the way the management is run, and is finally the last word in terms of responsibility. The buck stops with him or her, so to speak. There can be no higher sense of responsibility than the chairperson of the company. Then there is a managing director who is effectively the de facto and de jure person who runs the company on a day-to-day basis. Now here, the SEBI, realizing the implications of the fact that having a singular person as chairman and managing director, particularly for the top 1,000 listed companies, they felt that the responsibility for these 1,000 companies to the shareholders is very significant. They came up with a regulation which is effective from the year 2020, 1st of April 2020, that the chairman and the post of chairman and managing director will have to be split. Sorry, it cannot be the same person. It has to be two persons. And again, in the top 500 companies, there is now a further requirement that the chairman of the company, separated from a managing director, can also not be an executive chairman. He or she will have to be a non-executive chairman, which means that they cannot be performing day-to-day responsibilities. So you see now increasingly independent directors getting appointed as non-executive chairman of many companies across different sectors. This is what has happened since 1st of April 2020. Then you also understand who is a whole-time director and a executive director. They could be looking after significant business verticals or domains such as marketing, finance, operations, commercial, etc. Somebody could be designated as executive director finance. Somebody could be a whole-time director operations. Somebody could be, looking after logistic and supply chain management, etc. So they are involved in the day-to-day affairs of the company. In contrast, as I said, a nominee director has only a role in the board to oversee that the interests of the company who he or she is representing, is taken care of. So they have a role only to that extent. Now, independent directors, in contrast, emerged more prominently from the time the Companies Act 2013 came into being. Now, it was realized that, in many companies, there is a silent body of shareholders known as minority shareholders. The word minority is clearly representing of the fact that they hold shares less than, the majority. The majority is 51% and above. So anybody having up to 49%. And again, there, if you look at the shareholding pattern normally of most companies, you'll realize that again, within the minority stakes, you have different sets of individuals or companies there are people with bigger chunks, who will have probably 18, 20, 10%, etc. And there is a small subset of individual shareholders who are called as minority shareholders. They could be having minuscule percentages, 0.5%, but those could cumulatively or in the aggregate, constitute about 5, 10, 15, 20% or roughly thereabout. It is the interest of this small minority who are usually the non-assertive, non-aggressive minority, silent shareholders, so to speak, that the SEBI was concerned with. Often, I think historically and empirically, it has been seen that in some, if not all, not in all companies, obviously, that the management tends to disregard or ignore the interests of these minority shareholders. Hence, to give a voice or to represent and articulate their interests, it was decided to create this set of independent directors. This does not mean that the independent directors have any shareholding. They may or may not have, or are in any way directly or indirectly linked to the minority shareholders. Hardly ever. They are there only to represent the interests and to exercise a check and balance on the other management to ensure that the interests of that silent majority is not lost sight of. Hence, the need and the rationale for independent directors. Now, independent directors, so usually the requirement is such that depending upon the composition of the board in terms of numericals or numbers, if there are, for example, if there are 6 directors in a board, let's say on average, if 3 of them are functional directors or executive directors or whole-time directors, including the chairman and managing directors, then largely it is now emerging from out of corporate governance requirements under the Companies Act 2013 that an equal number of independent directors should be available on the board so that there is a counterbalance so as to represent the minority shareholding. Particularly in the case of listed companies, more importantly, the top 1,000 listed companies by share capital, and that when I mean top, it is in terms of the market capitalization or the share capital as is listed and traded. There, it is absolutely legally required that there should be 50% representation of independent directors on the board. I mean, it could be, if you have whatever is the number, normally the average composition ranges from about 6 to 12. You don't usually have a board which goes of more than 12 members. So if it is, I mean, most of the companies where I'm on the board as independent directors, we have an average of around, let's say, 6 to about 8 or 9. Then it becomes critically necessary that you must have an equivalent number of independent directors on the board. Now, independent directors, the way they are selected, again, the jury is out because traditionally the way they have been appointed is the chairman or the board identifies certain individuals where they feel that their expertise and experience that they bring to bear will be huge and beneficial to the company. So they approach them with an offer for appointment as independent directors. Then there are mutual consultations. Then if there is convergence of interest, if both feel that yes, there is a sense of comfort, then independent directors get appointed, and initially they get inducted as additional directors on the board with the approval of the board of management. But eventually, in the same financial year or the immediate following financial year, it is necessary that the shareholders approve the appointment of such individuals as independent directors. And how does this happen? This is through a proposal with a board resolution, a special resolution or an ordinary resolution as the case may be, that such people are being appointed as additional directors pending ratification by the in the AGM or the EGM as the case may be, which is the annual general meeting or the extraordinary general meeting of the company. Then the proposal goes, and usually in the month of September, the AGMs or the EGMs get held annually. So this is put up as a proposal with the board approval through as a resolution route. And the shareholders then give their stamp of approval for those appointments. So once that happens, ordinarily the term of appointment is 5 years. Now, however, in public sector companies, the government has chosen that it will be such appointments of independent directors will be only for 3 years, extendable in rare cases by 1 year or maybe another. These are exceptional instances. For example, when I was serving on the board until July of last year, on the board of a public sector undertaking known as Container Corporation of India Limited, known as Concord. It's a major player in the supply chain and logistics sector. There, I was there for clearly 3 years because that was a standard norm of appointment of independent directors, after which I have demitted office. I've ceased to be an independent director on the board. However, in private companies, either listed or unlisted, the term of appointment of independent directors is usually for 5 years. There is a provision that, again, there can be a repeat offer for 5 more years, subject to certain caveats that, again, the board of directors and the shareholders must approve of it, and that this will be only up to the age of 75 for an independent director. Following 75 years of age, if a company decides to continue with the services of an independent director, it must ensure that it happens through a very special resolution of the board, and to which at least 3/4 of the entire shareholding community must accord its approval. That means 75% of the shareholders must approve such an appointment through a special resolution if a person is in excess of 75 years of age, which means that it has to be an exceptional requirement and it has to be approved in that exceptional route. But I also want to mention to you that normally, after 2 terms of 10 years, 5 years and back-to-back another 5 years, it is mandated by law under the Companies Act that an independent director must step down, cannot be continued beyond 10 years, and there has to be a break of 3 years in between, after which, following that 3 years cooling off, he or she can be brought back to the same board. This is to ensure some kind of a break so that there is no, deep-seated vested interest that is created. So these are, again, finer nuances of corporate governance. The idea being that you don't create a vested interest group. But as I said, the jury is out in terms of appointment. What usually happens, and not always, but in certain instances, there is that disquieting comfort zone that is created where managements decide to pick individuals as independent directors who are not, the most articulate people. They are not the ones who are assertive. They don't speak their mind. They don't read material, generally speaking, and they don't express themselves in board meetings. The management would audit, and that's true of human nature. People will prefer status quo, which means that they would prefer independent directors who are quiet, who do not represent nuisance value to the company, who don't raise uncomfortable questions, who don't pry into the details of a company. So that is the trend. It's a different matter, and I will explain to you why I'm sort of spending a little time on the concept of independent directors. Is the role of independent directors is so pivotal or critical to the success or failure of corporate governance. Now, for instance, when the board meetings happen, before that, let me just wind up what I was saying. So there is this feeling which is emerging that there has to be this nexus which is now emerging that has to be broken between the management and a set of independent directors who don't raise questions, and there are caveats to that. And that is why the process of appointment of independent directors must become more open, and where a greater body of stakeholders must get involved, so that not only people of requisite expertise and experience are drafted into the board, but people who have the stature and the ability to ask questions of the management. So that is why there is an increasing feeling that the present process of appointment of independent directors must undergo a change. Now, there are consultations which are ongoing. There are debates which are happening as of now, but the jury is still out on how that gets conducted. Suffice to say, to go back on how independent directors should operate and are expected under the legal framework of the Companies Act, is that whenever there is a board meeting, usually the agenda is drawn up. I hope you understand what an agenda is. The agenda is nothing but a list of business that is proposed to be transacted in a meeting of the board. So there, They're all circulated in advance, at least 7 days prior to a board meeting, and with all the supplementary or the supporting material is required to be provided. Now, it is expected that independent directors will do their homework, will prepare themselves thoroughly, come prepared for the board meetings. Of course, board meetings today are virtual as well, which is completely fine, which is permitted under the law. Earlier, they used to be all physical, but that was before the pandemic. But today, you can do it in a hybrid mode, or you can do it entirely on a virtual, which is remotely, which is entirely permissible under the law. But be that as it may, it is imperative that independent directors must read the agenda and the documentation, come prepared so that when there is deliberation in the meeting, in the board, they must ask specific questions, because it cannot be an instance where independent directors are silent and every item of the agenda gets passed quickly and without any questions being raised at all. That's not how it should be. This does not mean, on the flip side, that independent directors should position themselves as an antithesis to the management. No, independent directors are intended as a subset to supplement and complement the management. But since they represent, and this is something which they should remember always, the silent minority of shareholders, they must read and ask questions so that nothing which is illegal or contrary or prejudicial to the interests of the minority shareholders and the wider body of stakeholders gets passed in a board. Which is why the liability of an independent director is also equal to that of a whole-time director, provided, and here are the caveats. The catch is that the matter should have got listed in the agenda formally, that means in writing. That should have come up with the board for discussion. And if independent director has chosen not to speak about it, either verbally or in writing, and if a decision gets taken, which eventually is found to be hurtful or prejudicial to the interests of the minority shareholders or any other stakeholder, then an independent director is liable. So how does an independent director safeguard himself or herself? It's simply by the fact that when an item is discussed, they must raise their voice if they have an opinion which differs from that of the management based on facts and figures and documents. They must express themselves freely and fairly, objectively and transparently, without any fear or favor. And this is where please remember the word, without fear or favor, which means they should not fear consequences of their articulation or expression, and without any favor to the management. At the end of the day, they have to be unbiased or unprejudiced, non-partisan players in the decision-making process. So if they've expressed themselves, they must ensure that in the minutes of the board proceedings, when the minutes are drafted, they should read what minutes have been circulated. And if there is whatever they've expressed themselves in the board, if it does not find mention in the minutes, they must draw attention of the company secretary immediately and the chairperson, saying that this is what was discussed. This is what I said as an independent director. However, this does not find mention in the draft minutes. Please, this is what you should do, and this is the formulation which should get incorporated in the minutes. If you have ensured that as an independent director that whatever you have said, your say is recorded in the minutes, you are safe. Or let's say if there was a circular resolution proposed, which is also permissible in corporate governance, a decision which is relatively minor or marginal need not necessarily come up in a board proceeding. There is a sense of urgency. So the company secretary, with the approval of the chairman, is free to circulate through an email what is called as a circular resolution, calling for a certain decision. In such instances, since that involves a decision, again, the same process is required or expected of an independent director, where they will have to clearly express themselves one way or the other. If they differ, they must say so why, with justification and transparently, and insist that it is recorded in the minutes. So the protection or the insulation or the immunity for an independent director is only available to him or her so long as whatever you've expressed, your say is recorded and documented. That's the only way you can prove that, yes, a decision was taken which is bad in law, bad in terms of interests of corporate governance, yet you stood up and expressed yourself, and this is what it is. So long as the minutes don't find mention of what you have said, then I think you're in trouble. But otherwise, you're relatively safe. This is how independent directors are expected. So again, please let me bring back the focus here to the fact that independent directors are not there to be contrarian to the management. They are there to supplement and complement fundamentally, but they are expected to protect and promote the interests of the minority shareholders as well as the larger stakeholders. And to that extent, they must find their say recorded in the minutes of every board meeting. So board is one such body, which is the largest body of corporate governance in a company. But below that, the Companies Act requires that you have to have subsidiary bodies such as committees, because a board is expected to meet ordinarily once every quarter, primarily to, approve the financial results or the statement of accounts of the company. That is the normal requirement. And, approval for raising loans, etc., mobilizing capital or any joint venture or any partnership, etc. That's what is the board's responsibility. But over a period of time, in between those quarterly intervals, there is a whole lot of work that gets done by companies. So there has to be oversight. Please mark the word. I'm consciously using the word oversight, or there has to be supervision on the part of the management. So how does this get done? That is where the concept of committees come into play. The committees are subsidiary bodies set up with the approval of the board, and they are smaller bodies which are consisting of one or two members of the executive management, whole-time directors, and one or two independent directors. And they are set up for express or explicit purposes, which is, for example, you have the audit committee, which is a statutory committee, which is mandated under the Companies Act. This is primarily to go into the financial accounts, look into all matters which relate to financials of the company, as to whether it's getting done properly. It's reported, there is a disclosure, and they interface or interact with the internal auditor, the external auditor, and the like. That's the liaison that they're expected. Then there are a couple of other statutory committees, such as Stakeholders Relationship Committee. This is a committee which is to look into grievances of individual shareholders or stakeholders, which come up in the form of grievances, complaints, representations, referrals, either to the company directly or to the SEBI. There is a portal in the SEBI, which where they can lodge their complaints, and then it comes up to the company. So this committee will have to oversee and resolve those grievances as satisfactorily and as quickly as possible. That is the responsibility of the Stakeholders Relationship Committee. Then there's a third statutory committee known as the Nomination and Remuneration Committee, which is meant to oversee the approval for the appointments to senior management, key management personnel, reviewing their performances from time to time, ensuring that appointments are cleared, terms and conditions are set, reviewing and doing annual appraisals, and most importantly, to try and promote the concept of continuity, which is to do succession planning. Because this is an extremely crucial element in corporate governance. It is not enough that a chairman and managing director, they will not continue for perpetuity or lifelong, right? Today there is a cap. MD or a chairperson cannot ordinarily remain in a company beyond the age of 70 years. Only in exceptional cases, through special resolution approved by the AGM or the EGM, can someone stay beyond 70. Now, to that extent, it is always wise and prudent to promote succession planning, so that you build a second tier of leadership, who is in a position to take over very quickly and seamlessly and assume responsibility. God forbid if tomorrow somebody passes away, there is some mishap, somebody, senior management is incapacitated for various reasons, or somebody has to leave, decides to resign for whatever reasons, or gets thrown out of the company. You cannot create a vacuum, because that is detrimental to the interests of smooth functioning of the company. So that's why it's necessary that you have a second line which is built of leadership, which is built up. That is known as succession planning. So the Nomination and Remuneration Committee takes care of this critical aspect, which is an underpinning of corporate governance. And then you have non-statutory committees, but which are also very critical, such as a risk management committee. Today, risk is intrinsic to every business. Risk is a constant phenomenon, whether it's risk arising from business or from outside the country, or it is within the country or within the company. So there are risks such as IT risks, cyber risks, for example. There are risks to finances. There are risks from out of dealing with traders, where monies don't come in time, debtors. So all of that is a risk. So risk management committee is providing oversight on how to minimize and mitigate risk from time to time. So it is a virtuous cycle that happens here. And that is why there's a critical role for the risk management committee. And finally, there is, apart from other finance committee, you could have multiple committees that the board may decide at its discretion. But there's another committee which which is again a statutory committee known as a CSR committee, which is the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee. But this is meant for listed companies primarily. But a lot of other companies are adopting this. The CSR is a statutory requirement under the Companies Act, where 2% of the gross profits in the last 3 years must get pumped into identified CSR activities, which are notified and listed in the Gazette as being eligible. It could be education, it could be social welfare, it could be promoting health, it could be, dealing with environmental matters, and a whole array of issues where the company decides to do public good. This is an important aspect. And this is where, the underpinning of CSR is that it goes beyond shareholders. It gets into the realms of stakeholders. So stakeholder interests are represented through the CSR committee. And hence, these are the various committees which come into play. I will just quickly before winding up in the next 5-7 minutes, let me also run through who are the other players who are critical to the success of corporate governance in a company. Take, for example, you have the internal auditor. You have the external auditor, which are the statutory auditors, which are representing the Controller and Auditor General of India, essentially. You can have rating agencies. All of this will have to play a crucial role in ensuring that there is accountability and transparency on the part of the management. Internal auditor and external auditor create checks and balances in ensuring that the financials of the company are reported factually and accurately and completely, so that there is nothing which is hidden, nothing which is pushed under the carpet, because that can be extremely harmful. If there are bad debts which don't get reflected in the company balance sheet, there are items which are kept off balance sheet, then it is extremely prejudicial to the interests of the company. So the auditors, both statutory and the internal auditors, they ensure that the financials are reported accurately, and that is a significant check and balance. Then there is this body known as the rating agency. You heard of CRISIL, you heard of ICRA, you heard of Standards & Poor, S&P. They all rate or grade the financial credibility of a company. They give a rating. AAA is the highest, for example, or A minus or AA or whatever. So there are different categories. Then there is BBB minus, and there is C, or there is negative. So the rating, again, is an independent evaluation, just as an internal auditor and external auditor are independent processes of assessment of a company's health or injury, as the case may be. Similarly, rating agencies also discharge a statutory obligation of trying to assess and say that the health or otherwise of a company is good or bad, and accordingly they will give that grade. Now, this grade is crucial because financial institutions go by, amongst the tick box, the checklist which they have for providing funds. They go through and see whether the rating agencies have, how have they evaluated a company. If there's a AAA, that means the company is run very credibly, its operations are very robust, and hence, the financial institutions or the bank may be more than happy to put in money. So, but you will find that there has been this failure of these three pillars also. Take the ILFS story I just mentioned to you. You look at any of the scandals, whether in the US, the three examples which I gave you, or in the three Indian examples, if the management failed, including the independent directors, this was representative of the failure of internal auditors, external auditors, and rating agencies. None of them discharged their duties faithfully and honestly. They were either willing parties, they were accomplices in hushing up matters, ignoring, looking the other way around, or they could be doing things covertly or overtly, or being active participants in the cover-up, which is why in the Satyam case, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and two of their senior partners, they were indicted. The two partners were, sent to jail, I think, for about 2 or 3 years for failing to discharge their responsibilities as auditors. Similarly, rating agencies, just look at ILFS. Rating agencies gave them AAA, but overnight, the entire bubble burst, and it became so messy that the rating agencies had to lower them to literally junk status. So this speaks poorly of the way these agencies have held themselves to account. So it is not as if having these institutional checks and balances will necessarily lead to good corporate governance, but it is, however, it's expected that these people will stand up and do their duties responsibly. It's a different matter, they may not, but at least this is the anticipation. And that is why there is accountability through the Companies Act, through the SEBI Act, through the SEBI LODR, or through the mechanism of the IPC, Indian Penal Code, or the Criminal Procedure Code, the CRPC, in terms of criminality, in terms of prosecuting these companies of being either covert or overt in their behavior. Then, to quickly wind up, then there is another animal known as proxy advisory groups. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. There are institutions, there are entities which are known as proxy advisory groups, which are thoroughly well versed with corporate governance practices. They are engaged by shareholders, some either not necessarily individuals, but a group of them, who advise them on how to look at company management affairs and represent them with due authorization. So they are known as the proxy advisory firms. So they come in and they sort of represent, they as trustees, they represent the interests of the group of shareholders. So they are also an important part in ensuring that there is a check and balance. Similarly, banks and financial institutions, when they assess a company for purposes of provision of funding, finance is the lifeline of a company. It's almost 99% of companies raise monies either through the capital market route or through banking and financial institution routes. It is imperative that the banks and the financial institutions must also do what is called as due diligence. Due diligence is absolutely critical. That means they must thoroughly check the books of accounts, look at all nitty-gritties of the way finances of a company are run before they extend loans, etc. It cannot be that once a loan is granted, then the company goes bankrupt, the account becomes NPA, which is a non-performing asset, and then the entire balance sheet of the bank goes haywire. Today, on an average, it is an open secret that Indian banks and financial institutions, most of them are sitting at NPAs of around 7.7 to 7.5%, which is very staggeringly high. This again because banks and financial institutions either have not had the expertise in looking at company managements or uh, examining and doing what was expected of their own due diligence. This is again failure of corporate governance. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are multiple players. There is a board of directors, there are independent directors, there are nominee directors, there are internal auditors, there are external auditors, there are rating agencies, there are banks and financial institutions, there are proxy advisory groups who should collectively, in their own way, discharge their own individual responsibilities so that their collective impact is such, the aggregate impact is such that the company affairs are run responsibly and responsibly. The final piece which I just wanted to mention to you is that there is something called as the Investor Protection and Education Fund, which the SEBI creates. Because often it is seen that investors are not very educated, savvy in terms of understanding the niceties, nuances of, the stocks or the shares that they hold. There is this herd mentality. People say, okay, I want to, this is a stock which is doing well. They see something in the television in terms of a news reporting, or they read somewhere, or it is spoken somewhere in some conversation, and they tend to believe that this is what is a stock which is doing well. That's not enough. Often when you see there's an IPO or an FPO, or let's say if you're putting in through a mutual fund, an investment, you will find a set of documents which are voluminous. At the end of it, in small print, it will be said that it will be the final responsibility of the investor to understand and make sure that they know what are the elements of risks involved in this investment. Now, that fine print in nominal fonts gets lost sight of. So the SEBI has realized that it is essential that the class of investors, it's not institutional investors, because they have enough advisors, they have proxy advisors, they have a battery of lawyers, accountants, uh, investment banks, which will advise them how to invest. But it is a smaller minority of shareholders who are uneducated. That doesn't mean that they're illiterate, but they are financially illiterate. They're financially illiterate because they don't understand the risk to return ratio. So they blindly put their monies and invest. So it is necessary to overcome their financial illiteracy, that they're educated, they're enlightened, and that they are more informed before they make an investment decision. That is why this fund has been created, where fines, penalties, etc., get diverted in a certain proportion under the provisions of the Companies Act. And through this Investor Protection and Education Fund, IPEF, that the SEBI is able to mount a sustained investor education campaign over a period of time. They conduct these campaigns either online or offline in different places where they invite shareholders, interested shareholders, and then somebody well versed, thoroughly a thorough professional, then speaks and tries to educate and enlighten the investor so that they can make informed decisions in the process of investment. So broadly speaking, I'm aware it's almost 11:15 now, and I need to close in the next 15 minutes. I need to provision for a Q&A. That I could go on. The subject is so expansive and so vast that corporate governance, one could speak much more, but I will limit myself to these. This is a broad oversight, an overview of the fundamentals of corporate governance. I hope it has made sense and you've been able to grasp. Please feel free to raise any question. And I do believe that I may not have missed out much in terms of the critical elements of corporate governance, because corporate governance today is so essential or intrinsic to the health, not just of that company and the health of the investors, but also to the health of the economy as a whole. An economy can ill afford a financial crisis emerging out of, either an lack of trust of investors. So You cannot have an atmosphere or ecosystem where there is mistrust or distrust of companies. It is terrible to the way the economy will function. You must have a vibrant and robust corporate sector, which must thrive and flourish, because the corporate sector will drive the manufacture of goods and services as well as the provision of services, right? Whether it is a from manufacturing plant or provision of pure play services. That is why the health of a company in terms of good corporate governance is very critical to the overall health of an economy, and more so of a maturing and emerging market economy such as India. So I will pause here, and I hope it has made sense. Thank you so much for your patient hearing, and I'll be happy to field any questions if you have over the next 15 minutes or so. Thank you once again. Ramakant, you're not audible. I'm sorry, you're not audible though.
Thank you so much for your time, and you have taken us to various nuances of corporate governance, the foundation of it, the structure of it, and the importance of it, taking us to various examples which are really eye-opener for everybody, the students of corporate governance, the companies, the government, and all that we have seen. Here are a lot of questions for you from our side. Maybe the other part of the questions maybe from my side. With the enactment of IBC, with the enactment IBC,
okay,
Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, whether the corporate governance has improved or it has become more vulnerable.
No, so to that point, the IBC is of relative recent origin. So the impact of this is yet to be seen, but largely the IBC is intended to ensure that, where there is an insolvency or a bankruptcy, then the winding up or the liquidation of the company can happen more seamlessly, and it is not stuck up in a regulatory mire as such. But the general sense is that it is early days. But having said that, I think it has had a beneficial impact. I don't think it's had a negative impact, because it's essentially to declare bankruptcy and insolvency. So there is a structured process in which this declaration happens. So this ensure that if a company liquidation does not get stuck, because there have been times where promoters and founders have refused to wind up pay back to the debtors and the creditors. So this was intended to hasten and fast track that process. But I believe that it is still early days. It is yet to settle down, but largely the sense is that it has been beneficial.
Okay. Any question? People have comments?
Yes. Very good afternoon. Very good morning, sir.
Good morning.
It was very a knowledgeable session. Even we got to know a few of the new words here.
Thank you.
Sir, I have one question related to the governance part.
Please.
When we talk about the board of directors, even now the resource person, one of the person from private company is being a part of the board of directors under government sector. How it might help?
Sorry, I didn't hear your last sentence. Can you repeat that?
In one of the board also, like government sector, HAL, for example, if we take. So one of the board of director is the chairman of Reliance company, who is the owner of the private company. So how it might help in corporate governance?
So if I've understood your question right, is that how does it work in terms of inducting private players, private sector persons into the
Yes.
board of directors or the management of public sector undertakings?
Yes, sir. Indulging private persons in the management of the government companies.
Let me just qualify and say that in public sector undertakings, which are either wholly or largely owned by the government of India or the state government or the union territory government, where majority stakes of 51% and more are held by the government. The chairperson, managing director, often they are the same. The whole-time directors or executive directors and nominee directors are all government functionaries. There is no private player that I recall at all. The government will secure and ensure that they are only private players. However, if there is only through the route of a nominee director or as an independent directors can any private participation happen. Now, nominee director could be that, let's say if there is, let's say Reliance Capital or Reliance Finance, just to take the example that you quoted, if they have funded any public sector undertaking to a large extent, then their nominee at the level of senior management, could be a director or general manager or whoever it is, could be nominated as a nominee director, but they will represent equity stakes of less than 49% or below. Only through independent directors can you then have, but independent directors are expected to be independent, not representing the interest of any company. So it is again provided that if you are a whole-time director in a private company, you can be an independent director, but with certain caveats. So there are enough safeguards and checks and balances which have been carved out by SEBI to ensure that if a private sector entity comes in the board of management, board of directors, it can either only be through, in a public sector undertaking, again, that's the qualifier, only through a nominee director route or as an independent director. But again, they will ensure that there is no conflict of interest, and that is completely ruled out ordinarily. Do you know of any instance where there is a conflict of interest that you come across? No, the example that you cited,
Yes,
was there any perceived conflict of interest? Was it reported?
in fact, not conflict of interest, sir, but how it will help the government sector. Is it with the intention to enhance its for financial performance or
So the idea of inducting nominee directors and or independent directors, as the case may be, is to bring in a certain set of skills, expertise and experience in various domains which are related to the company performance. For example, when I was picked up on half a dozen company boards, it was by virtue of my civil service background at the senior most level as Secretary Government of India in terms of public policy, in terms of my experience as Director General of Shipping in the maritime sector, logistics supply chain sector. I'm also in the United Nations panel. So, and I'm just sort of saying it with utter humility, with utmost humility, that they saw value that I would be able to bring something to the table in terms of expertise and experience. Similarly, when somebody else is drafted, they could come with a finance background, which the company feels it will add value or enrich the way the proceedings are conducted. Somebody may come in as an outstanding HR professional. Somebody could come in from a marketing background, right? So they could represent different interest groups. So the whole purpose of getting somebody from a private sector, as you're saying, is with the best of intentions, at least on the face of it, that they will come in with the skills, expertise and experience which will be valuable to the company and which will sort of, raise the bar, enrich the performance of the company.
got it, sir. Thank you, sir, for your.
Okay.
Here's a question from a student.
Yes, please.
Good morning, sir. My name is Akshay. Sir, I have a question. First one is related to shareholders' value, and next one is related corporate governance related to SME. My first question is, central features of corporate governance involves policies to communicate with, involve and protect shareholders, protect the shareholders. Sir. If the purpose of corporate governance is not simply to increase or maximize the shareholders' value, then what is the purpose of corporate governance? Because every shareholder wants to increase their value in terms of investment or their rights.
Yeah. So to answer your first question, when I gave you my presentation, I never meant that the stakeholders' interests will override that of a shareholder. The primary purpose of every company is to enhance shareholder value, for sure. That because at the end of the day, they are owners of equity. They are shareholders. They have provided their hard-earned money in whatever form in the company. So it is only fair and just that they must get a contribution back in terms of dividends or whatever else, depending upon the performance of the company. That is primarily the objective. Yet, the qualifier is that no company today can do business only to enhance shareholder value. It is not living in a bubble. It is living in an external environment where the operations of the company, either as a manufacturing of goods or provider of services, is impacting the community. It is impacting a larger set of players who are involved directly or indirectly with the company. For example, I gave you could have a company which has a manufacturing plant in a rural area, right? There are a lot of incentives which are offered by the government, state governments, in terms of provision of land, lower rates of revenue, easy conversion from non-agricultural land to for land for other purposes, electricity tariff subsidy, in those backward areas. But at the end of the day, when you have availed that benefit, let's say a company has availed that benefit, set up that manufacturing plant, is carrying out, then you must be responsible to the community nearby, right? I gave you that specific example that when you have got affluents, where there is waste, there are any number of waste. It could be electronic waste, it could be physical waste, which gets discharged from out of manufacturing operations from the plant. When that affluent gets discharged, it cannot be that the community is impacted adversely. That waste must be disposed, treated, processed, and then discharged, so that the land nearby doesn't get toxic. There is no adverse effect on the soil or the water table nearby. Or let's say if there is a gaseous discharge of gases from the company pipes, it cannot be harmful to the environment nearby. It could affect the health of the villagers nearby, right? So they're not shareholders in the company. They have not put in money, but they are stakeholders. So today a company cannot afford, that's why I brought in the concept of ESG, environment, social, and governance. You'll have to marry or balance the interests of both the shareholders first, primarily, secondly, also of stakeholders. So how this is balanced, how this is married into a happy blend, that is the challenge and the responsibility of a good board of directors or a management, how they will do it. And today, a lot of managements are very conscious of this, that they cannot. Why do they do CSR? Why is it that 2% of profits is mandated under the Companies Act to be towards CSR? It is again primarily because, why do you promote the health, the environment, the ecology, etc., the life cycle balance? It's all because a company has an impact on the environment, immediate, etc. So it must, the bottom line is that a company must be responsive and responsible. That is the word. That's the proposition.
Thank you, sir. And the next one is, sir, because the large-scale companies are the good follower of the corporate governance, then how should corporate governance matters to SMEs, small and medium enterprises? If it is, then how can good governance improve the performance of SMEs in emerging markets like India?
So the corporate governance framework is generic. It is neutral to whether it is a large company, a medium-sized company, or a small company. Whatever path it has chosen, either it's in a public sector in the government of India can also have an SME, or it could be a private company. the corporate governance standards or the underlying principles are almost identical. SMEs usually will not go, the route of many of them could be private companies. They may not become public in that sense. They may not want to raise capital. So there is a slightly softer regime of corporate governance for them. But my advocacy, and I am representing a few smaller companies, medium-sized and large companies as well. So my pitch as independent director on the board of directors of all these companies has been consistent, that whatever is the standard template of corporate governance for a major company, please try and follow it as far as possible, even in a smaller company, because the principles are well meant. You need to be transparent. You need to manage your affairs efficiently and accountably. So you must be accountable to your shareholders. So it doesn't matter whether you're a small company or a medium-sized or a larger company. So long as you abide by the same principles, that your books of accounts will be transparent, they will be factual and a fair representation of all that is happening within the company, then you're good. So the health of the company will be maintained. So even if you're an SME, it doesn't matter. SME must be conscious of the fact that your statement of accounts, your financial results must be completely factual and transparent. You cannot hide something just because you're a smaller player. No. If it means that you need to have an accountant, yes, so be it. You need to have one. You need to be guided by those principles. So fundamentally, there is no distinction per se, because if you create this artificial distinction, then there is trouble lurking. Then if you think that, okay, as a SME, I don't need to follow this, I can compromise somewhere, I can cut corners, then you're asking for trouble. And it doesn't matter whether you're in an emerging economy or, it could be in a least developed country, LDC, or you could be in a mature or an advanced first world economy, as they say. It's all pretty much the same. Corporate governance is fundamentally adherence to good governance. Good governance in terms of being accountable, transparent, and true to character. And again, I'll come back to the same proposition I said. Business ethics and professional ethics should be paramount. It doesn't matter whether you're a small player, medium or large player. So long as you're not professional, you don't have ethics to back it up, then you're asking for trouble.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
To know, for the benefit of our students,
Yes.
is it recorded information or internally it is done as a practice? Or
Sorry, I think your voice is echoing, Ramakant. I can't hear you.
is there any recorded information either internally maintained or made publicly available regarding the cost of corporate governance?
So when it comes to the access of material information and data on corporate governance and the costs involved therein, when you say cost, that would mean compliance cost, am I right? What else is the cost? There can be only a compliance cost of disclosure. Now, typically the annual report of a company, which is expected to be furnished to the shareholders, and even anybody can access it today in the public domain through websites, because it's not that the annual reports are available only through the physical medium, the hard copy form. They're available electronically or in soft copies as well, right? So the pen picture of the entire aspect, including the costs which are there, secretarial cost. For example, what is cost of compliance? It is secretarial cost. What is the payout to an auditor, internal auditor, external auditor? What does it take to have a secretarial auditor? What are the costs involved? All of that is available in generally speaking, in an annual report of a company. So pretty much there is a disclosure. It's all in the open. It's available for public consumption.
Apart from the statutory cost involved, is there any other cost which makes it other? The putting in place the systems, the infrastructure, is there a measure which is done?
So the costs are decided,
Like
proposed.
we say transaction.
So the
Similar to that.
systems improvement are typically initiated by the management, comes up to the board or it can even be triggered as a suggestion by an independent director or a nominee director, which when the management and the board will then look at it with as a proposal and come back. They normally do the evaluation. For example, one of my standard initiatives which I have recommended, and almost all the companies, and I'm saying it with humility, is which people have followed, is that I said, look, today there are virtually about 50 to 70 disclosures and reports that you need to make to multiple agencies from time to time on a monthly basis, quarterly, half yearly, annual. It could be disclosures to for purposes of taxation, direct, indirect taxations. There are secretarial compliances to be done. There are reports to be sent to SEBI, to stock exchanges. I said, all of that you are monitoring on a physical basis. I said, increasingly, there are softwares available which give you a 360 degrees perspective of all compliances across the board that you need to do. Universally, from over the year, you just install that software. The software will trigger an alert at least 15 days in advance, a systems alert, and it will tell you that this is what is due as a report or a return in terms of a disclosure. And you will then be prompted. That prompt comes not only to the vertical head, but also to a functional head at the level of an ED or an MD, as they choose, so that they're aware, they're able to monitor it, ensure that it is complied. Then there is a trigger 1 week before. Then there's a trigger just on the day. So I said the systems improvement, this is just an illustration. I said the systems improvement, it should be systems driven. It should be driven by the software, automated. We cannot be relying upon an individual to decide, whether he or she is furnishing a report or a return. Somebody may miss it out. And then the consequences can be grievous because you don't send a report or a return, an important report or return. Tomorrow there could be a show cause notice issue. And that could even attach itself as a liability, depending upon the seriousness of the matter. And could even come up to the board level. The directors, independent directors could be held liable. So then I said, no, let it be software or automated driven, where, you get those alerts across the board for all compliances. And so that has been done. All companies where I have myself prompted this, they followed. So systems improvement is a constant process. There is a cost. For example, typically the one-time cost for these softwares are anywhere from around 5 to 10 lakhs for installing these softwares. That's an expenditure well worth spent. 10 lakhs one-time capital cost is well worth it. And there could be nominal maintenance costs on an annualized basis. But these are costs which are again reflected, decided, deliberated by the board. And usually they're all reflected in the annual reports.
Thank you. One last question. With the emphasis on corporate governance coming in, are there any emerging careers apart from independent directorship inside the company on a regular basis for the students to think of?
So finally, as I said, the corporate governance framework is pivoted and upheld by a large number of players. Let's understand the entire spectrum. When you look at that, every vertical head, and that is where, for example, I'll illustrate. When I look at a risk, and I'm chairing almost most of the companies where I am involved as an independent director, I'm chairing the risk management committee as the chairperson. I make it a point consciously because risk management used to be treated as a very sort of a neglected area. I've ensured that there are risk management committee meetings held every quarter, unfailingly, whether it's a listed or an unlisted company, because I keep saying that risk is inherent, intrinsic, and so critical today in a very volatile business environment, either indigenous or exogenous worldwide. Risk is impacting every line of business. So I make it a point that you meet regularly, there is a feedback. So what I say that in that committee is that we have a risk management framework or a template, a policy that is articulated, that makes every individual player in different verticals in the company co-own risks, which means that every individual, particularly the vertical head, the business head, the functional head at the level of the senior management, including the executive director, up to leading up to the managing director, they're all co-owning the risk. So that means that the career, when it comes to careers in corporate management is across the board. You can be a finance guy and you will be discharging corporate governance, because so long as you uphold basic principles of finance, which means that you carry out your accounts diligently, your balance sheet is accurate and is a true representation, you are discharging corporate governance. Take marketing, for example. If you've maximized efficiencies, minimized costs, maximized, optimized profits, you are doing good corporate governance, because that is the essence of it. You're not indulging in waste. So whatever role you discharge, you have a certain subset of corporate governance responsibility attached to your role. Then you have a company secretary role. Company secretary is again a key element of corporate governance. In the board, independent directors, whether you're working for, let's say, if you're working for the big four audit firms, KPMG, EY, etc., as an analyst, associate, or whatever level, when you go and audit, you are part of a corporate governance setup, because you are upholding that principle as an external auditor. You may be in an accounting firm, in a CA firm, you're doing an internal audit, engaged as an internal auditor. As long as you're upholding principles of fair representation of those accounts, you're part of corporate governance. If you're representing a law firm, if you're representing, let's say, one of the rating agencies, if you're representing any other independent entity, proxy advisory, so all have a bearing on corporate governance. So careers in this are, as expansive. I mean, as it's literally the sky is the limit. You can be in every element of this and be part of corporate governance. So there is nothing like a dedicated corporate governance, except maybe the secretarial function is a line or a direct function where you do corporate governance day in and day out. Just that, as a company secretary, for example. For that, you have to get through the ICSE exam and clear it. That's the only frontal or direct role. But otherwise, there is an indirect role attached to every function that you discharge.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. It was indeed pleasure listening to you. Second year researching and received something. Then for the batch, it was indeed very informative and very comprehensive. We look forward to your association, and once again, thank you on behalf of the students, management, and all the members. Let's look forward to the interactions. Thank you so much. And
so on behalf of myself, I would like to thank all of you, particularly the students, for their very attentive engagement. I'm delighted. I wish all of you the very best in your careers and in your personal lives, and also to the Chetan Business School in its endeavors successfully going forward as well. Thank you for the invite, Ramakant, and thank you very much. Have a good day. Thank you. Take care. All the best. Bye-bye. So I'll log off now, Ramakant.
thank you. Please.